just welcome everyone to the Fishing in the Future event today. We're really lucky. We've got three great speakers who you all know well, going to take us through: Barrie, Mike and Jerry. Barrie, Mike and Jerry are going to speak for around about 6 to 8 minutes, depending on how long it takes them to get through. And then we'll go into the questions after. We'll just keep the questions specifically on the subject. Today we're talking about the Joint Fisheries Statement, and we all know how to behave online, so we'll all be behaving accordingly and giving everyone a chance to speak. So just to give you a little background, Fishing in the Future is a fisherman-led charity, and we're here to just help the conversation, keep fishermen well informed. And we've done 2 or 3 of these now. Adrian's done a couple with Emma in the past on different subjects. We like to take a subject that's really important to the fishermen and have a good talk about it. And then any questions that the industry feel that they can ask, we get a good panel of people together like we have done today, and we're able to hopefully get the answers the fishermen are looking to have.
Afternoon, everyone. Okay, so why it's important between 6 and 8 minutes. I'm going to have a quick skim through and I'll leave the rest. Any questions, we'll have the Q&A session at the end. So why is the JFS important? I suppose really you've got to go back to the past history of fishery management, common fishery policy for decades, equal access to a common resource. We gave away effectively everything. Anyone with any fishing background in this call knows very well what happened there. We were subject to a top-down command and control regulation, and it was basically the CFP and European fishery management based on really too little too late. The waters have been ravaged for decades. Lack of management was reflected now, actually. We had the first meeting of the Finfish Advisory Group last week, and there were sort of 15 front-runner species discussed in non-quota species, and they were all either in the southwest or in Scotland, which was a little concerning because I think it reflects the rest of the coastline seems to be devoid of any need for fishery management plans, especially for non-quota species. So I think that tells us something, and it reflects the impacts and the lack of both fishery management and fish in other areas. And with greatest respect, the CFP has been to an extent something of a get out of jail free card for DEFRA and fishery managers generally. But now EU exit, trade and cooperation agreement, I'll mention that later. We're now an independent coastal state. We're going to take back control, and we need the development of the Fisheries Act 2020, and that's really where the Joint Fisheries Statement comes out of. So it's first time for decades that we're going to be responsible for national fisheries management, notwithstanding the trade and cooperation agreement, which largely has been something of a disaster, both in terms of access to fishing opportunities quota, the loss of exclusive access to the 6 to 12, 1,800 licenses still issued to European vessels, and fly shooters and beam trawlers, mainly from Holland, still devastating our waters and taking our fish. And there's no monitoring, but I won't go there. So firstly, you have to understand, sorry about this, the Fisheries Act, all 133 pages of it, which you'll be glad to know us guys have read. And there are, though, in that 133 pages, there are some important bits from a fisherman's perspective, at least. So the Joint Fisheries Statement and the Fisheries Act are intertwined, and you can't get away from it. So Section 1 of the Fisheries Act reads about the 8 objectives, which you probably looked at: sustainability, precautionary ecosystem, scientific evidence, bycatch, equal access, national benefit, and the climate change objectives. And they shouldn't, despite the fact I've flashed over them, these are really very key. These are going to be the drivers for much of what comes later. Section 2 is all about the Joint Fisheries Statement, and in a nutshell, really, the Joint Fisheries Statement is what puts the meat on the bones of the Fisheries Act. Now, DEFRA describes the Joint Fisheries Statement that sets out the high-level policies or rules that will guide fishery management over the next 6 years, developed jointly by the 4 administrations, and aims to deliver protecting and, where necessary, recovering fish stocks, reducing the effects of fishing on the marine and coastal environment, and supporting a modern, resilient and environmentally responsible fishing industry. So here endeth the lesson. So JFS is what makes the Fisheries Act real. Section 3 to 5 sets out the procedures review, how things work. They need for a Secretary of State fishery statement put my teeth back in, every 6 years. It's a dynamic document. It's subject to change. Section 6 to 11 is 6 whole sections. But in a nutshell, this is fishery management plans. And it would appear that the DEFRA, through the Fisheries Act, is putting their fishery management plan, fishery management eggs, if you like, all in that fishery management plan basket. Again, read out from page 2, it says fishery management plans will set out policies and measures tailored to specific fisheries to manage fishing activity, to restore and or maintain fish stocks to sustainable levels, working in partnership with fishers and other stakeholders, applying the fishery objectives to our fishery consultations, including seeking to increase the overall number of stocks fished at maximum sustainable yield or equivalent, and seeking to establish total allowable catches, and prioritising the development of management approaches for non-quota stocks and not before time, some might say. So this is where I mean that the Act, the Fisheries Act 2020 and the Joint Fisheries Statement, which comes out, is they're intertwined. You've got to understand both to understand either. So this is key really for fishermen, especially. Fishery management plans are what's going to determine what you can fish, where you can fish it, how much you can fish, and whether you can survive as a fisherman or not in the longer term. It talks broadly about co-management, collaboration, a joint approach. Well, we'll see. And the first non-quota species are supposed to be published by the end of 2023, and the rest by 2025. The JFS is responsible, government's responsible to report every 3 years, and that's really going to be the litmus test of whether they're actually working. We are very limited in terms of time, I think, for some species, there's no doubt. So, we've got consultation, then DEFRA will think about the consultation, then they're supposed to publish the first of the NQS fishery management plans by the end of 2023, the rest but these are only publishing. So I've been berating DEFRA, really in the nicest possible way, of course, to actually get your finger out. There are some species in some areas that are desperately in need of a management plan, as are the people who rely upon them. So it's going to need a whole lot more data, and I think there are huge opportunities there for fishermen to get stuck in. There's going to be some challenges, especially trying to get data from the EU. DEFRA announced or admitted last week in a meeting, they're having real trouble getting fisheries data, even from the Dutch fleet of fly shooters that are working the Eastern Channel and the southern part of the southern North Sea. And the minister's on record saying data is key. Data is key. We really need all the data. Yeah, all they're getting is from us. They're getting nothing from the 800,000 recreational sea anglers, and apparently very little from the EU. So it's vital in this respect, and this is going to be a long-term project. Don't think we're going to respond to this consultation on the GFS and then everything's going to be fine. This is going to go on ad infinitum or ad nauseum, depending on your point of view. It's the best or worst of things, really. We'll just have to wait and see. But I think it's incumbent on fishermen to engage here, and DEFRA have been making some efforts in that sort of way. It's either or. This is a crossroads, I think, for the fishing industry. Businesses depend on it, and not least, of course, in food security terms, which has been highlighted specifically in the last few weeks with the Ukrainian position. So that's FMP's fishery management plans, absolutely key. Read it. 12 to 18 sections are licensing. It's a whole separate subject, you'll be glad to know. Licensing of foreign vessels in their own waters by the responsible devolved administrations, which is going to be interesting. Could throw up some interesting things. You can license foreign vessels in Scotland, could do it in Scotland, Wales, and England, Northern Ireland, etc. So that could be quite interesting. 19 to 22 sections are all about penalties. Nothing dramatically different there, I think. 23 to 27, fishing opportunities. This is very interesting. Secretary of State will be responsible for UK quota and days at sea, but he or she only has a responsibility to consult with the other devolved administrations, and you'll be aware probably of the tensions there's been, especially between Marine Scotland or the Scottish government and the UK in terms of the negotiations with that. Section 25 is potentially fascinating, but probably will be something of a damp squib, because this is what provides the requirement to must include criteria that transparent and objective includes criteria relating to environmental, social and economic factors, history of compliance, contribution efficiency to the local economy, historic catch levels. This is a change from what was gone before in some ways. In other ways, it's very similar, because Article 17 of the Common Fishery Policy said much the same, and no one took much notice of that. So I'm not really holding my breath on that. And frankly, we've got more worry about lack of fish on inshore grounds in many areas than we have lack of quota. Section 27 could be a key. It's the sale of English fishing opportunities by tender or auction. So these are your ability to access fishing opportunities. And if the government has a process where they can actually sell them at auction to the highest bidder, already over 50% of our UK quota is in foreign hands, mainly corporate, so be warned, that's potentially dangerous. And if you read Schedule 5, Wales can also sell their own fishing opportunities. So make what you will of that. Sections 28 to 32, discard charging. This is an interesting one for a lot of people, either on a fisherman basis or by PO. You're going to get charged for unauthorised catches. And it's the good example of the Fisheries Act setting the framework of everything that the government could do, subject to discussion before finalising. And that's key. There's going to be some very interesting debate about that, and opportunities for engagement. England holders only, quota holders, interestingly. Possible conundrums with boats from one devolved administration fishing under different roles in other devolved administration waters, because the JFS does, and the Fisheries Act does say you can fish anywhere in the UK, irrespective of which devolved administration you're in. And those sections also refer to charge collectors. And there's a particular concern here if the MMO go down the route of hiring private charge collectors to charge you for your discard, your landings, your unauthorised catches, then where's the impetus, or will they be encouraged to be particularly enthusiastic if their income is related to it? Sections 33 to 55 include the financial aid rules, and vitally, the MMO's ability to make charges upon fishermen for various services. And I'm sure Barrie will remark on that on his presentation. So then there's a load of annexes and schedules. There's an 80-page consultation document, 133 pages of the Fisheries Act. So you're not expected to read those in the 6 days or 7 days it is, I think, to the end of the consultation, but you do need to make sure that your views have been accounted for. And in a nutshell, if the JFS does what it says on the tin, then we've got half a chance, I think. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, hi, thanks, David, and thanks for everyone to come on, and thanks for the invitation to come along here. I mean, I guess what is obvious is that everyone will respond to this differently. And indeed, you just click on the link it gives you, and you go online and you fill in the portal. I mean, organisations like my own, I've drawn up a draft response and I've sent out to members for the comments, and then we'll take it back and we'll rewrite the draft. So I think what is important in situations like this, that we go through a full consultation process with our own membership, because at the end of the day, it's only then that you can start to talk about proper co-management, really invested co-management. But I think what is clear in the document itself is that it is trying to marry the ambitions of the four policy authorities. I mean, you can just see it in the writing that it goes some way to satisfy some and goes a different way to satisfy others. And that's been a difficult sort of process over this last 18 months. And some of us have been invested in that in the various groups. I guess what it does do, it lacks a lot of detail that we'd like to see in something like this. I mean, there is a high degree of detail, but it is lacking detail in key places. Having said that, you know, I'm very negative on the CFP, and part of the problem with the CFP was its very sort of paternalistic approach on things. It was very top down, and when you get policy that's created top down without listening to the people that it's trying to manage, then what you get is anarchy. So it would be very difficult to condemn a policy for not having detail, when in fact at this level you don't want it that detailed. So there is the room within the document for I guess policy authorities, the UK, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, to be slightly ambitious. So it does, the language kind of falls in between being prescriptive and ambiguous. And for me, that's not a bad thing, Because in Scotland, and it'll come as no shock to anyone on here, but in Scotland, we're looking to put in policy that fits the fisheries that we have. And we've got some very complex mixed fisheries up here. And I guess you've got complex mixed fisheries everywhere. But what that does determine is that when you put policies in place, you put them in place in a way that sort of solves your problem in your area. And there's examples of that. I mean, the regulations in the North Sea are different. North of, is it 5630 than they are south of 5630. We operate in the Norwegian zone to a different set of regulations, and we operate in the Faroe zone to a different set of regulations. So there's nothing necessarily bad about creating regulations in an area that don't roll over to another area. But I guess we should be aspirational in terms of trying to set down fisheries plans that align and connect all around the coast. But it's not necessary that has to be delivered. I guess one of the criticisms of the document as well is, and you may have your own thoughts on this, is that it lacks a certain amount of ambition in terms of what it talks about in terms of future fishing policy. It seems to have, stopped from breaking free from the shackles of some of the fisheries management sort of components or pillars that was embedded in the CFP. And it talks about, the UK providing world-class fisheries management systems. Well, that's very difficult when you're trying to align to a system that we think failed. How does that then become world-class? So there is some difficulty there. And I guess the document does lack some sort of ambition in terms of the science. It talks about the best available science. Well, that's what we have through now, through the sort of countries feeding into ICES and the models and the management and the data gathering goes through that. And we would suggest that's not good enough in its current form. So if you're going to provide world sort of leading fisheries management systems, then you have to look at what you're going to do with the data, because it's really not sufficient now. And it would be useful that they take that on board and try and work out how they're going to deliver a solution to that problem. Another part in terms of the narrative within the document is the fact that it seems to unplug humans from the ecosystem approach. It talks about the ecosystem approach and sustainability, but it almost picks the human element and the community element and the socioeconomics out of that and deals with it in isolation. So when you read through it, that kind of spits out at you that something's not quite right there. And we were on a call just earlier that I chaired, and there was a number of you on here was on there, and it was about managing the marine space. And what it doesn't do in the document, which I think is one of its failings, and don't think I'm being negative here, because I think the document overall is well balanced. But what it doesn't do is talk about protecting fishing areas for fishermen. It talks about everything else, but it doesn't think that we need protecting from other marine users, which for me was a kind of weakness in the document. The other part of it in terms of the co-management, they talk about participatory management. And to get participatory management, you need systems in place. You need co-management systems in place. And only then can you produce bottom-up policy. And I guess there is a misunderstanding of what that may look like. How do you deliver true co-management? You look back at the EU, and they created the advisory councils to try and provide that sort of regionalisation or help the regionalisation issue, but also to provide the stakeholders with a voice in. Now, I don't know what Barrie would say, because he was in the same advisory councils as I was, but at the end of the day, they weren't that productive. So if we are going to produce systems that supply co-management, then we need to make sure we do it early and we do it well. And we need almost firm wording in there that holds government's feet to fire. In Scotland, we have the Fisheries Management and Conservation we operate through, and we've got like an inshore version of that as well. And if you read through the document, what is clear in there, for my mind anyhow, is the fact that it doesn't consider that fishing is a low carbon producer of food. It talks about, carbon sinks and the industry's footprint in terms of the carbon deterioration. But a lot of that's just the adverse effects. It doesn't focus on the positives. So I'd like to see more part as well on the part that we play in terms of food security. I think Jerry mentioned that when he opened up there, because food security going forward is going to be a key issue. And one would imagine that if you are going to protect the fishing sector to provide food and feed the nation, then you may want to look at different text in the final version. Now, I appreciate that the JFS was written and drafted at a time which was pre-Russia, pre-Ukraine issue. But at the end of the day, it may need revisited to actually incorporate some of that issues, because we are an important component in terms of low carbon footprint and in terms of supplying food for the nation. So that's just a quick walkthrough of, not in terms of the document itself, but my reading of what is contained in the document, some of the positives, some of the negatives. But I would just sum up by saying that the document itself, I think, is pretty reasonably balanced, other than some of the comments that I've made. We don't want to be overly prescriptive. That prescriptiveness will come in the fisheries management plans. But even there, we don't want them to be overly prescriptive, because you know what happens when you go overly prescriptive. You then start to get anarchic behaviour. The system starts to crumble. We witnessed that during the 90s, the turn of the century, while a member of the EU. So we do need to be very careful in how we move forward over the next 2 to 3 years on this. And I'll leave it at that, Mr.
Well, in one sense, it's all been said, so I could just go off and have my tea now. But no, I think that I think in 10 years' time that we'll look back and we'll see the Joint Fisheries Statement along with the Fisheries Act, which was adopted at the end of 2020. I think we'll see them as a turning point in the way we manage our fisheries. And I think it's a 4-step process. We of course left the EU and we left the common fisheries policy, although we've retained a lot of the fisheries legislation as EU retained law, and that will be either amended or replaced as we go forward. So leaving the CFP was the first step. The second step, I think, was the Fisheries Act, which gives ministers the legislative powers. This is the third step. This is the Joint Fisheries Statement. And of course, it's joint because it pulls together the devolved administrations, the 4 fisheries administrations, into a common approach. Although devolution fisheries are a devolved area of responsibility, there's a general recognition that we need to do things, some things anyway, cooperatively, and this is a stab at that. But as has been said, the fourth and most important element, because it contains all the detail, will contain all the detail, are the individual fisheries management plans. So I think it's really important to see the Joint Fishery Statement as a step. It's only a step, but it's an important step. I think that's the point. But I can quite see, even though the Joint Fisheries Statement is draft, it's a draft that's out for consultation, so it may yet change a bit. But I can quite see that anybody looking at the JFS consultation, it's far from clear. If you ask the question, what does that mean for me in my particular fishery? What does it actually mean? It's quite hard to discern what it means. And I think that's because, like the Fisheries Act, it's a framework. It doesn't provide the detail. And Mike, I think, made that point very well. I think it's a bit like the structural elements in a building, or the infrastructure, if you like, the plumbing, the electricity, the basic walls, but then the rooms and the furniture are what will follow, if that makes sense as an analogy. So the NFFO has worked quite hard on this. We formed a working group. We met 3 times with DEFRA officials that are responsible for the JFS to get an understanding of what their thinking was. And the group came up with our draft response, which is now on our website. And broadly speaking, we welcome the Joint Fisheries Statement, and as we did the Fisheries Act. We think, yeah, they haven't got it exactly right everywhere, but it's broadly moving in the right direction. And it gets the balance more or less correct in most cases. But our response also contains a long list of things that will need to be addressed as fisheries management plans are developed. So I don't think we're necessarily critical of the Joint Fisheries Statement, but there are things that need to be taken into account moving forward, and how the industry participates in the policy formulation process in the fisheries management plans is a really important element. There are places also where there's a lack of balance and proportionality in the statement. There's some fine-tuning needed there. Then there's a really big question about, okay, we're developing these fisheries management plans. They're domestic policy, that's UK policy. How does that dovetail? How does that work where other countries overlap, where the fisheries overlap, where we might want a joint approach or not? We have regulatory autonomy. We can do our own thing. Where do we want to do our own thing? So a whole series of questions about how the domestic fits with the international. And then there are external impacts. Well, we've seen, and it's been mentioned, Ukraine is a game changer, but the fishery, the EU as a partner, Norway as a partner, all of those kind of elements can have external impacts on how we manage our own fisheries, need to be taken into account. And then there's a long list of underdeveloped areas. And yeah, I don't think we're necessarily overcritical, but we're flagging these up as some issues that need to be taken into account. And the whole question of marine spatial planning and potential displacement just gets bigger and bigger. The complexity, what we had in the common fisheries policy was blanket measures, and then you needed to make derogations to make it fit particular fisheries. That led to unbelievable levels of complexity. So, simplicity should be an important goal in itself. Similarly with fishing capacity, it's mentioned, if you don't have a balance between fishing capacity and your available resources, nothing will work. So it's rather important that we get that right. The whole concept of co-management, very, very light, probably for good reasons, but this is what needs to be fleshed out. Similarly, there isn't really much discussion about the benefits of having a very diverse fleet. Fleet diversity kind of underpins sustainability. So I'm not going to go through it all, but there's a lot in the Joint Fisheries Statement. There's a lot that's not there, and I think that's what the job of work lies ahead in terms of fisheries management plans. I don't think anybody underestimates that developing a joint fishery, developing a fisheries management plan for each fishery is going to be an easy task. It's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of change of doing things differently. But I do think that we have a framework now that is provides us with an opportunity that hasn't been there for the last 40 years, which is why I say, I think when we look back in 10 years' time, we'll think that this was a step forward. Thanks.